Evening. My name is Peter Christian Iger. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. It's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight to this conversation. Thanks so much for joining. If it's your first Gotham Center event, I invite you to visit us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find the rest of our spring calendar of free public events, as well as dozens of podcasts and hundreds of articles. Those of you looking for a deeper dive may also be interested in Gotham Ed, our new online education program, offering monthly courses and lecture series on all things New York City history at gothamed.com. If you sign up to the newsletter, you'll be eligible for a 25% discount in the month of February for African American History Month. Those of you who are familiar with us know that in addition to various programs supporting research and our public conversation series with authors of recent work in New York City history, the Gotham Center also regularly convenes panel discussions like tonight's, which attempt to bring an historical perspective to bear on contemporary issues. No issue is more important today or will be in the near future, of course, than COVID-19. But as we noted in the billing for this conversation, the present crisis is really at the broadest level threefold. The virus itself has exacted a devastating toll in human life, nearly 500,000 deaths in the United States, with almost 30 million cases of infection. But this calamity has also further exposed inequities and weaknesses in the US public health system that have made the epidemic worse than it might have been. Likewise, the shutdown has devastated the nation economically, but as usual, disproportionately. Low-income families and children, many of them women and persons of color, have absorbed the brunt of not just infection and death, but job loss, job and income loss, housing, and food insecurity. While the upper middle class has been largely spared any negative impact, and the 1% has seen its wealth treble. After 40 years of growing inequality to the highest level in the developed world and perhaps the greatest point in US history, COVID-19 has made the situation far worse. Finally, there is global warming. Although there is no evidence directly connecting the virus to climate change, epidemiologists have warned for decades now that rising temperatures will not only have a multiplier effect on common fatal diseases worldwide, but also introduce new ones, as melting ice caps and plowed rainforests unleash germs that have been safely contained that will easily spread through the ever more global marketplace. Although it still feels scarcely recognized, we have entered, quote, the pandemic age, as Dr. Fauci and medical historian David Morenz commented in a recent study. And unless there is dramatic action on this front, we can expect that it'll produce a vicious cycle as we see today. Tonight's is the first in a three-part series the Gotham Center has organized with the help of Sharon Zukin, our moderator tonight. It is, to our knowledge, the first time that New York City's three great universities have partnered on such an endeavor. And if you have not registered yet, I encourage you to sign up for tomorrow's discussion on the public health crisis at Columbia University's Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health, and Thursday evening's conversation on global warming at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge. The conceptual thread further uniting these events is the overwhelming role that cities like New York will have in both impact and potential action as the centers for the majority of the US and global population. Although policy solutions will have to be national and international, and the health risks involved obviously have no geographic limit, the people on the front lines are and will be to the greatest extent urban as a matter of basic arithmetic. New York, for that reason, occupied the eye of the American storm for a long time, no less because it has also become one of the country's most economically unequal cities in recent decades. But as the deepest reservoirs of civil society and the general electorate, cities like New York also hold the greatest promise for combating these problems to which we are exposed. We are never powerless before the challenges we face, and history provides us with more than enough guidance in how to meet the future. The question is always which lessons to draw. With that said, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our star-studded cast of experts this evening. We'll be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on New York City's economy and the matter of how to best address this crisis, given our experience with other major disasters in the recent past. Since I've already gone on for a while, I want to give them as much time as possible to speak, I will not further identify them here beyond the very brief listing of their many credentials in the building. But I think it's fair to say that we have recruited an ideal dream team for the subject before us, and I am very grateful to them all for their participation. With that said, I'm going to hand things over now to our moderator, Sharon Zukin, herself a renowned expert on New York City history, who will be guiding the conversation from here. One final note, discussion will last till about 7 p.m. or so, at which point our guests will attempt to answer your questions. But please feel free to send those questions in at any point during the next hour using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again for joining us, and please join me in welcoming our esteemed speakers with a bit of silent applause.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to our panelists. It's hard to overstate the effects of the pandemic on the city of New York, a city with outsized assets and liabilities that is measuring incredible rates of unemployment, now down to 11%, unpaid apartment rents, which may now total between $1 and $2 billion, office vacancies, 15%, and a shortfall in property taxes, which the mayor says may come to $2.5 billion. How do we understand an economic crisis of this scope? And how do we deal with its fiscal consequences? How does the city raise money to right the wrongs of structural inequalities and balance the needs to create and repair new infrastructure? The issues that face us are enormous. But we have an excellent panel that will try to answer these questions, or at least pose them in more creative ways. Let's hear what they think. Ronnie, you have been the director of New York's Independent Budget Office since before 9/11. How bad is the current fiscal crisis?
First of all, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. IBO, the Independent Budget Office, was established to provide nonpartisan technical information on the city's budget and the city economy to the city's elected officials and the general public. So as you can imagine, we've spent the last 10 months trying to get a grasp on a situation that's continually changing. Basically over the past year. I'm going to start with a few takeaways. So just in case I run out of time, I squeeze them all in. But the first is that the local economic downturn that was prompted by the pandemic is unique, both in the severity of the downturn that occurred and how quickly it happened. Having said that, I wanted to emphasize what Peter said in his introduction, which is this is first and foremost a health and human crisis. No matter what its fiscal impacts, the economic impacts have fallen most heavily on the city's lower income population and its small businesses. In terms of unpaid rents, in terms of food scarcity, even in terms of not being able to connect all of our students to online education. So it's affected everything, but hit most hard at the lower end of the income scale. The second main point is, while the pandemic has certainly strained the city's fiscal resources, it is absolutely nothing in any way, shape, or form like what happened in the 70s, which is what I expect Kim to be speaking to. And finally, I'm going to conclude with some comments on our own forecast and why we expect that it's going to take longer for the city to get out of this mess than for the US as a whole. So first, to understand the severity of the recent downturn, I want to compare it with two other recessions that the city experienced over the past 2 decades. Note that I'm defining these recessions in terms of local employment, gains and losses, as opposed to the official US statistics that are typically cited. So I'm going to start with 20 years ago, which was not long after IBO was first created. The city's economy was already contracting when the World Trade Center was bombed. In the downturn that began in 2001, New York City lost 230,000 jobs. And to put that in context, that was over 6% of local employment in a period of about 2.5 years. The other recession I'm going to speak about is the so-called Great Recession, which began in 2009, and which was considerably easier on the city's economy than for the nation as a whole. For one thing, the city of New York entered the Great Recession later than most places. For another, our economy declined less deeply. And finally, it recovered more rapidly than for the US. And I can go into more detail on that if you'd like. But over the course of the city's downturn during the Great Recession, the city lost about 140,000 jobs, which was less than 4% of total employment. So contrast the 230,000 jobs with 140,000 jobs, 6% of employment, 4% of employment. And moreover, the 140,000 jobs were lost in a little over a year. So it was much shorter as well. More intense, but shorter. The recent pandemic-induced recession, though, looks very, very different. From February of 2020 through April of 2020, so just from last February through last April, New York City lost over 900,000 jobs. That's 1/5 of total employment in the city of New York. View it from a slightly different perspective. The decade before, I guess, February 2020 was a really good one for the city of New York. We added a huge number of jobs over the decade. But in the course of 2 months, the COVID recession wiped out a decade's worth of strong employment gains. Gone. Which is, you know, it's hard for me to even get my mind around. With the easing of some of the COVID-related restrictions, the city job growth did rebound, at least initially over the spring and summer. But the recovery slowed again in the fall. And by December, which is the last month for which we have good data, employment in New York City was once again in negative territory. New York ended the year with a loss of 560,000 jobs for the year. I should say that more than 200,000 of those job losses were in leisure and hospitality. And that made up more than half of the employment in the leisure and hospitality industry. And these are not the city's wealthiest employees. And you can imagine how hard they've been hit. Although the rollout of the vaccines, I think, gives us some reasons for optimism, the city's economic condition, at least, is far more grave than it was in either of the past 2 recessions. So now I'm going to turn from the economic impact of the pandemic to look a bit at its fiscal impact. And obviously the recession and the continuing pandemic have had a big impact on the city's tax collections. There are a lot of different ways to measure this, but one way that I think works is to measure the impact is to look at what the city was expecting in taxes at this time last year, and then compare it with what we now expect is going to happen. So on that basis, city tax revenues are going to fall short by over $10 billion over 3 years, compared with what the city of New York was expecting in the mayor's preliminary budget, which was released last February. So just over that 1 year's period of time, the city's expectations of revenue over 3 years fell by more than $10 billion. Obviously, that's a lot of money. To give you some context there, the city is expecting about $63 billion in tax revenues this year, and roughly similar amounts came in last year and next year. So it gives you a feeling for the order of magnitude of what's happening. The next thing I wanted to say is that in the past 2 downturns, unlike this one, the city of New York has benefited from having its real property tax, the biggest of its revenue sources and its most stable revenue source, continue to grow, even though cyclically sensitive taxes like income taxes on individuals or businesses were actually declining. So in the past, we've been able to rely on the property tax to keep things going. That makes sense because the property tax is the city's most stable source of revenue. Moreover, the city's property tax system is structured in such a way that it typically doesn't just stay stable, but actually rises during a downturn. And that was true of the last two downturns, at least. But as we've just found out, in the current downturn, the administration is now forecasting that the property tax is actually going to decline. And the mayor's estimate, again, over a 3-year period, is that the property tax is going to run about $2.5 billion short of what they were expecting last year at this time. It's also a $1 billion year-over-year decrease from this year to next year. So it really hits next year. Conversely, the city also relies heavily on a number of income taxes, all of which are cyclically sensitive. They're actually not declining as much as we might have anticipated for a number of reasons I can get into. But on that front, we're doing a little better perhaps than had been expected. The last main point I wanted to make was that IBO is projecting that the city's economic and fiscal recovery is going to lag that of the US as a whole. One of the reasons is that the city's economy has become very dependent on tourism. We're a more diversified economy than we used to be, but tourism is a big deal here. And it's going to take a long time before the arts and entertainment and restaurants and everything else that makes New York, the place we want to be, get back up and running, and tourists, and particularly international tourists, are going to want to come back. But the other big reason that the city is going to lag is because the crisis the shock has accelerated a long-term structural change that we've been seeing, and that's working remotely. Many employees, and I think a lot of firms now, have seen the advantages of working from home. I think a lot of this was going to happen anyway, but right now, given the shift to remote work, it's not clear to what extent firms and individuals are going to be back in town. And if they're not, that has ripple effects throughout the economy. Everything from the office sector to residential real estate, to the restaurants in Midtown and everything else. So even after we're fortunate, and I hope that employment returns to its pre-pandemic peak, I think the city of New York is going to look very different than what it looked like just a year ago. And on that, I'll conclude.
Great. Pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you all forgive me. I have some prepared remarks just because we have only 8 to 10 minutes. So just kind of want to stay on track. I just want to say Ronnie kind of sold herself short a little bit. The IBO put forward a report that really documents the various revenue solutions, cost-saving measures that are available. And she kind of sold herself short because it's a remarkable translation of the minutia of municipal finance in very clear terms. So I encourage you all to check that out. So what I want to do is kind of speak to this moment a little bit, to kind of historicize the possible solutions, which I'll speak to in a little bit, but within the recent past, if you will, talk about the solutions, and then kind of reflect, if I have some time, on the upcoming mayoral election. So just very briefly, I mean, I approach the problem, the existential threats of New York City, as an urban historian. And so what I want to do is kind of historicize the different models that were available and which emerged in the wake of the New York City fiscal crisis in the 1970s. And I want to suggest how this time is different. So first, there was the pursuit of growth and revitalization through stadiums and convention centers. We can think about the 1992 opening of Camden Yards in Baltimore as a case in point, but there are many other examples of the stadiums and shiny convention centers as a means of revitalization. There was the embrace of commercial mega projects, super centers, and warehouse stores. There was the creative city model. We see the impact of people like Richard Florida, and the ways in which public dollars in tax increment financing, tax abatements, and the like were used to build neighborhood galleries, shops, and restaurants, and all of which for the so-called creative class. That was another model. And as the historian and social critic DeVarian Baldwin has recently shown, there was the expansion of the meds and eds model, with city blocks, in his words, turned into laboratories for knowledge-based commerce. And so if we could think about those different models, I want to suggest that this time is different, and why those older models may no longer hold, to add to the kind of doom and gloom story that Ronnie kind of laid out. And the reason why I say this, first off, COVID-19 and the spread of more contagious strands has called into question the core presumption of people gathering in close proximity at a baseball stadium, at a convention center for a concert. We can say that Amazonification, online retail, and the decline of place-based consumption would seem to make the supercenter model untenable. Third, plenty of small businesses and little shops and things have struggled mightily over the last year, with many closing their doors, kind of obstructing the creative city model. And with some forecasting the quote, great contraction of universities, the whole meds and eds revenue generating model seems uncertain. So those are kind of the problems as I see it, and why the models, the older models, which emerged in the late 80s and early 90s, may no longer prove useful and effective in generating revenue for institutions that are based in New York City, but also exacerbating the crises for the city itself. So if those are the problems, then what are the solutions? What Sharon has asked and Peter has asked are the precedents from the New Deal to the 2008 financial crisis on which we can draw. And so I want to kind of say that, depart a little bit here and to say that, you know, precedents are no doubt important, but there's a problem, I think, of looking back at the New Deal, for instance, whose solutions were predicated on the exclusion of Black people, and whose legislative lifelines arguably helped to rekindle the outsized power of financiers over our lives today. And so I want to caution looking back to the New Deal as a model that we turn to, and instead insist that we look at contemporary social movements, to the claims and articulations expressed by the movement for Black Lives. The movement for Black Lives has recalibrated budget priorities, or at least sought to do so, has staked the road to recovery with a new moral and ethical framework as the guide. We could think about the claims to divest and invest articulated over the summer. We could think about People's Budget LA and other participatory budgets around the country seeking to recalibrate the expenditures, municipal expenditures. That movement also treats race, gender, class, sexuality, among other axes of discrimination and belonging, I would add, as constitutive of discussions of crisis and recovery, offering a racially literate method for approaching recovery itself. And the method has the effect of piercing the otherwise technocratic realm of municipal finance, a realm that has all too often been dominated by appointees, bankers, credit rating agencies, and the like. And I think the method is not just pie in the sky, it also offers solutions. So if I kind of go back to what Ronnie had, the report I had mentioned at the outset, what does this method help us see? If we take some of the options described by the New York City Independent Budget Office, it would mean, one, not raising paratransit fares, which would likely be passed down to wheelchair-bound persons, for instance. It would mean not raising vehicle fines for multiple violators, so as to avoid the disgrace in the city of Chicago in which Black and brown residents see their vehicles impounded left and right and being further enmeshed in a web of debt, which makes it still more difficult for them to consume in locally based ways. And it would mean not raising higher fares, user fees, for child support cases, which may fall disproportionately on Black and brown mothers. And so that is what we might call a movement for Black Lives method, if you will, would offer us in approaching the budget solutions and possibilities put forward in a city like New York, but elsewhere. And so I can speak a bit more. I mean, in many ways, that speaks more to the cost saving budget allocation question and less to the revenue generating question, which is an important distinction there. Happy to speak to the latter in the question and answer. I mean, the short and sweet, to give a preview, it really revolves around progressive income solutions. And the burden may fall very well on institutions that are less able to escape and flee, like the firms, such as universities, who may now have to, whether through payments in lieu of taxes and other mechanisms, may have to offset the budget shortfalls. But let me just kind of say a bit more about what we conclude with, what we should avoid in thinking about economic recovery. So, you know, with the New York City mayoral and council elections on the horizon, perhaps the most striking and concerning parallel to my mind is not the 1970s or the 1980s, but actually the 1993 mayoral election, which we saw Mayor Giuliani take the helm in 1994. And so the historical analogy is not perfect, but I'm thinking here of how Giuliani was both the surface wind of anti-Black animus and rode the wave of racial revanchism, fears of crime, and the crisis narrative all the way to Gracie Mansion. So we should not avoid, that is to say, seeing the ways in which white supremacy is given strength by the crisis narrative in the framing of the problem that we have talked about, how crisis, in other words, can mediate the path to recovery through draconian solutions. And again, there are many reasons why this moment is different. I think for one reason, for instance, is whereas Giuliani and company turned to the kind of Disneyfication of Times Square in order to attract and meet the needs of tourists, it may be that kind of model of Disneyfication may be untenable. And the prison fix, to borrow the language and words of Ruthie Gilmore, may also be untenable given the budget squeeze that many municipalities around the country, but also in New York City, are under. So that's a long way of just kind of saying that to me, we should be wary of the racial revanchist story that capitalizes off of a crisis to win the election in the fall. Thank you.
Kim, this calls for you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much to Sharon and everybody for organizing this event. It actually feels really, at an emotional level, it feels actually really great to start to, just after living through the last almost year in the city, it feels good to be able to start to gather together, even in this strange way, to think about it and to try to understand it and to make sense of what's happening and what might happen from here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the politics of the present moment as I see them and comparing them some to 1975. And this past year, of course, the 75 fiscal crisis has hovered over New York. And I think part of the reason for this is obvious. The city is confronting, as we've heard, serious fiscal difficulties, sustained big budget shortfalls that are estimated in the billions of dollars. Unemployment has been very high. At one point, the city government was talking about taking out substantial short-term debt to cover the budget gap. It was quickly reprimanded for even floating this idea by Governor Cuomo, also by the New York Times, who then drew the parallel explicitly to the 70s, saying that this was what brought on the fiscal crisis, was the accumulation of short-term debt. What's more, most of last year, New York confronted a hostile, unsympathetic federal government, much as it did during the 70s. When Mitch McConnell said last summer that states facing fiscal problems should think about bankruptcy, even though legally they can't do so, this could not help but bring back memories of the famous Daily News headline, "Ford to City Drop Dead." But I think that the comparison actually, there's another register that people are drawing on in making the comparison with the 70s. And that is that I think that really almost as soon as the pandemic, as the coronavirus began to unspool last spring, there was a sense that the city is at a crossroads now, and that the fiscal difficulties pose not only an immediate problem, but that they call into question certain guiding principles that have structured New York's politics in recent years, and were doing so really right up through 2020. And the rapid, surreal transformations of last spring seem to hold within themselves a question. Will there be other changes for the worse or the better? Can the city return to what it was a year ago? Is that our goal? Should that be the goal? To bring back, will the Midtown offices reopen? Will the small businesses come back? Will Broadway operate at full sway? Or is that return impossible? And is it what we should want anyway? And I think there's a way in which the fiscal crisis of the 70s has seemed a bookend to almost this crisis. Part of the reason people have been drawn to thinking about the 70s is a sense that at that point, as now, it was a time not just of a fiscal problem, but when one way of thinking about the city, of thinking about New York, of thinking about government, was giving way, called into question at a basic level and forced to give way to another. And people wonder, reasonably, I think, is this another time like that? Are we standing on the edge of another kind of change? Now, as was the case in the 70s, the way that we understand the crisis will shape how the political response develops. And what happened then, as Dustin was suggesting, is that there was, part of what happened is that the problems of political economy in the 70s became a moral narrative about the failures of liberalism in general. And I think that while there may be some effort to reanimate that today, it is actually a very different moment, and the critical difference, the very different political nature of the situation now really separates the problems of what will happen from this point on from the 70s. In other words, the austerity response then does not mean austerity now. So first, as Ronnie suggested initially, the fiscal crisis today, while severe, is less drastic and less endemic than in 1975. In 1975, the city's outstanding debts were essentially equivalent to its entire revenues. And much of the debt that the city bore was short-term debt that had created tremendous pressure to be repaid within a year or so. What is more, part of the reason that crisis kind of developed as it did was that the budgetary issues there was a very great lack of transparency about the city's budget. The situation today is actually different, thanks in part to the IBO and also to changes in the city's management. The accounting problems in New York in the 70s were not unique to New York. Many cities actually had them at that time. But the fact is that today it is a different situation with regard to what people even know about city finances, as well as the severity of the fiscal problems on their own terms now. Second, in the 70s, New York was quickly singled out and blamed for its problems. All of the problems of the city were interpreted in part as a natural outgrowth of the city's own public spending priorities. The reason for the fiscal crisis was thought to be the generous public sector of New York. That's what President Ford said. That is what the rising conservative movement had to say. It is largely a position that even the city's liberal, kind of the people who came forward to staff the governor's agencies that took control of the city's finances, that's how the problem was understood. Many of the problems of the city in the 70s were actually the result of national economic trends and policies. Then they did by no means only affected New York, but that was how the problem was interpreted. At this point, New York is obviously far from alone, and the problems the city is confronting are widely shared and seen to be shared by cities and states across the country. And so I think the case that New York, or even that any one of these cities, is uniquely to blame for its fiscal woes, and thus these can be pinned on its alleged fiscal irresponsibility and moral laxity, it will be a lot harder to make that case today. This reflects also the causes of the crisis, which in the 70s developed out of broad changes in political economy, which again, we can talk more about, but nonetheless kind of took shape over many years. Whereas this reflects, at least most immediately, a public health disaster or an exogenous shock, as an economist might put it. And I think this too really shifts the way that the crisis can be talked about and understood. Finally, I think this crisis has forced a new reckoning with the importance of functional public services and institutions and their necessity for our political and social survival. Public health research, public health clinics, public hospitals have been revealed as vital parts of the health of the whole body politic of the city. As the terrible reliance on them in the peak of the pandemic in the city last spring demonstrated. For many people in the city and across the country, the central experience of the pandemic, or one of them, has been the withdrawal of the public schools. And what happens when a set of public institutions that people rely on to educate and raise their children and provide the social support that makes labor force participation possible, what happens when those disappear, when they are not available or not safe? So that in that way as well, I think the whole question of what will happen to the schools is actually one that points to, the necessity of public institutions to life as we think of it. And I think, as Dustin was saying, this is closely connected to the Black Lives Matter movement and the debates following George Floyd's death last summer over the question of funding the police, defunding the police, the role of the police in city life, and in a way the carceral state more generally. Because I think the question has been, what threatens us? What keeps us safe? Do the institutions we rely on to protect us actually do so, or do they pose a danger? And these are the questions that Black and Brown New Yorkers and the many white people who participated in the marches last summer as well were asking of the police. But there are questions that are in a way posed also by the pandemic itself. Who or what is actually, what is danger, what is safety, and where does it come from? So in the 70s, the fiscal crisis became hopelessly entangled with a moral narrative and also with a set of racist fears and the portrayal of people of color as driving the crisis through their use of the public sector, and also through the irresponsibility of liberal leaders, the greed of unions. Today, though, I think there's something about this crisis that offers or may offer a political opening and a different way of thinking about what is the key to the health of the city. Schools, vaccines and their distribution, public health clinics, these are truly the key to the rebuilding of New York, more than the question of whether people will return from the Hamptons, more than the question of what will what will happen to kind of particular business enterprises. And I think the question is then, how can we get the resources for these public institutions to reopen and to do so safely and build a city that in its institutional framework actually values the lives of its citizens? Crises do have a way of throwing things open. And as we struggle to emerge, I hope, from the nightmare of the past year, it is also a chance to ask whether what we had before is what we want to go back to, and what kind of city we can build in the future from here. So.
Thank you. Adam, could you open us up to the global situation?
I hope so, Sharon. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel, especially as a resident of New York, but by no means a specialist on New York economy, political economy, or history. So I'll be brief so as to keep the floor as clear as possible for those who actually do know. I think I might be able to add a couple of broader perspectives. One is the global and international perspective. So everything that Ronnie described so vividly about New York's experience has been repeated in several other major cities across the world. In Europe in particular, where we've seen similar lockdown, reopening, new lockdown phases, even more intense in their cyclicality than what we've had in this city. But cities like Paris and London have suffered a similar catastrophic damage to exactly the same sectors. So the entertainment and leisure sector, hospitality, all of them have taken a huge hit. Exactly as in the United States and in New York, it has been a gendered recession in that respect, because it is above all women who were affected in many of those sectors. It has also been, given the ethnic and racial balance of each one of those societies, racialized as an experience, with migrant workers, particularly vulnerable migrant workers, particularly exposed to these shocks. So that is a very common experience of the world cities of the world. If you look at figures for Paris, for instance, you see a similar collapse in GDP over this period. So I think this is something that New York, as it were, ideally would look in solidarity to other similar global cities, in the same way as we think of climate politics as a city-to-city business increasingly. I think we should also very actively be looking, to that experience. Much as we miss the tourists, we should now be in solidarity with each other as tourist cities, trying to think through the future. Because it is overwhelmingly people from cities who go to other people's cities too. So it is the same group of people. The good news, admittedly utterly anecdotal, but from the finance Twitter world that is my daily diet, everyone who's living in a city in a country in which this crisis has been much better managed, above all the colleagues and friends who are living in Chinese cities, say that really very little has changed. So one of the standard answers to would it all be catastrophically different in future is just look at Shanghai, where frankly nothing appears to have changed very much at all. So it's a completely anecdotal, but I think it's worth opening up that other possibility, which is that there are very powerful reasons for being in the cities, and those still prevail. Though, and this goes to several people's points, many of these trends, particularly in the United States, given the particularly ruthless logic of particular types of corporate governance in the US, were working anyway. And so this may provide a catastrophic opportunity for expanding on that logic. So, but what I thought might be most useful is really to add a little bit of a macroeconomic gloss on the comments that Ronnie and Kim were making in particular, and I know go to the heart of Destin's work, about why it is that our current circumstances might not be as apocalyptic as they were in the 70s, or not capable even of being turned politically in an apocalyptic direction in the way that they were. And there are some very powerful macroeconomic forces, in other words, to do with huge balances in the financial markets and in fiscal policy that I think give good reason for thinking that those opportunities might actually be there. And it's not just that, as it were, the Democrats won the election and so we have an administration which is much more friendly. And I would love to hear the views of the other panelists about the implications of the rounds of life support / stimulus that are coming our way in the next year, and how significant those might be for state and city level funding. But there are two things that I think are really worth hammering home here, and they all really center on the question of interest rates, because one of the things that made the situation of New York in the 70s so terrifying is that any given debt burden was prospectively amplified by the prospect of the nightmarish sorcerer's apprentice logic of compound interest, and at increasing interest rates, and especially if you are in the unfortunate position of being downgraded. So you were in a catastrophic cycle of intensifying financial market pressure. And there were moments in the spring where people anticipated something like that happening in the municipal bond market, of which, Destin is the great scholar, and his new book is precisely on this kind of dynamic. We saw a catastrophic opportunity or possibility in the spring. And it hasn't transpired. And it hasn't transpired because of absolutely gigantic interventions. I mean, that is the other drama that was unfolding in New York City in March, whilst we were going through the shutdown, lockdown cycle, and there was this catastrophic collapse in small business and service sector work, is interventions by the Fed and the New York City branch of the Fed in particular in the key financial markets in this city that stabilized the American financial system and stabilized the financial system of the world. And they were doing this on a scale multiple times larger than they did in 2008-9. So the New York Fed was buying assets at the rate of $1 million a second in the last couple of weeks of March this year. So that's orders of magnitude larger than Ben Bernanke and co were doing in 08-09. And the consequence of that is twofold. On the one hand, what it does is to nail interest rates at close to zero for the foreseeable future. And that changes the entire economics, political economy, and politics, flat out, naked, hardball politics of debt. Because you have to be, frankly, rather twisted, not just conservative, but like twisted to somehow turn a big debt pile into a monstrous problem right now. Because if you look, say, as Ronnie's team have done at the balance sheets of Wall Street, their debt, their interest burden costs fall to zero. It's astonishing. If you look at the profit margins of Wall Street, they zoom up in this year because they're not paying any interest on their funding anymore. It's extraordinary. So that's one dynamic, and that changes the ball game for public finance. Then it becomes, interestingly, essentially a matter of naked political argument, because it's very difficult to invoke the budget constraint as a veil, because it's really not there. I mean, if you can find anything to spend money on that yields any kind of rate of return, it pays for itself. And in the freakier outliers of the world economy, like Germany, the government gets paid to borrow money. So it's, you know, this is not an unusual situation to be in. The other effect of this, however, and this goes to the sort of critical undertow, which I thought was fascinating of Kim's intervention and Destin's as well, is this is a hyper-conservative policy. In other words, it's conservative in the sense it's avoiding crisis, but it's also underwriting one key element of New York's success model since the 70s, which is the dynamo of Wall Street and financial speculation and the financial industry, which continues to be an absolutely key part of the New York economy. And once again, repeatedly over the half century since the 70s, national institutions in the United States have intervened to underpin that bit, at least, of the New York economy. And that is, as it were, essential for the stability of the world economy. If there had been a financial implosion in March of the type, it would have had ramifying effects literally across the entire globe. But in our home, in our city, it also structures all the other options that are available, because it creates a particular type of inequality, it compounds particular types of disadvantage, it creates certain sorts of job openings, forecloses others. We are simultaneously, as it were, preserved by this in the positive sense of that we do not face the 1970s style interest spiral. And on the other hand, however, also condemned to a kind of repetition and continuity. Now, some of that may change and it may move itself off to Jersey or Long Island or Connecticut or whatever, but fundamentally, that is another one of the big stories of 2020, is that particular structure of power and money in New York City was preserved at all costs with the mobilization of all necessary resource. One option that opens up is the massive, historically unprecedented stimulus that we may see this year, depending on the congressional bargains. But on the other hand, it does beg the question of how, against that kind of wall of money, you really do open up the space for a progressive politics in a city like this. And that, again, is not a problem unique to New York, of course. It's typical of London, it's typical of Hong Kong, it's typical of Shanghai. It is, in fact, one of the differences between those cities and a place like Berlin, for instance, where there isn't a financial sector of that type. There may be many other types of similarity, but in that sense, New York's position is part of a global financial hub syndrome that we see in many places of the world.
That's great. I'm vastly cheered that the good news is that New York will be saved by continuing financial speculation. You know, Adam, in your great work on the 2008 financial crisis crashed, you make the case that the big banks benefited more than they should have done from the recovery. How do you see the big banks faring in the next year?
Oh, they, and as Ronnie's data show, have done just fine, and so have their staff. Their profits were great, and being a very well protected, white collar group, they turned out to be able to work very well from at home. I think the question, so that element of the structure is highly stable. The regulatory reform that was imposed on them and that some of them espoused with a view to survival actually made them much more robust this time around. So they are, in that sense, a permanent element of the story. I think the big questions, then this goes to the issue that Ronnie raised about real estate, is what in the longer term the rationale of JP Morgan's monstrous tower on Park Avenue is, if it turns out that in fact, as many of them discovered, productivity in fact goes up when people are working from at home, because in a hugely hyper-competitive environment like that, it kind of removes the last boundary between your domestic and your work life, and there's really no limit to how rapidly you can expect people to spin their wheels. So the banks have been a solid element. There was not a crisis. We may not be out of the woods yet with regard to commercial real estate, and you can see the Feds at all levels anxiously monitoring the REIT market. There was a huge amount of leverage built up there, some very big projects which may be longer term, at least not looking at the prospects they expected, but it wasn't the immediate crisis. And they didn't need, to that extent, the direct type of intervention they received in 2008. Do they systemically benefit from the broader interventions of the Fed and CARES and so on? You bet they do. Of course they do. That's what has kept their business relatively solid this year. But they made big provisions, and we are not out of the woods, because in the end, the business losses, after all, accumulate into bad loans, into the loan book losses. And that may be coming our way.
Well, you've all outlined two really interesting dynamics in the present situation. One is the contradiction between the fixed capital of real estate and the, let's say, the immobile human capital of those people who cannot or choose not to move away from New York City, and the mobile capital of all investors, including the tech companies who, on the one hand, have leased a gigantic amount of office space and are building millions of square feet of office space in New York City, while they are opening the door to their workers remaining at home. Spotify, for example, has given their workforce, Spotify, which, by the way, is one of the players in New York's tech economy, while not being a U.S.-based corporation. Spotify has given their workers the choice of working remotely, working from one of their offices, or working in a co-working space. So there is, even though flexible real estate was a big benefit to the tech economy that emerged from the 2008 financial crisis, that flexibility is becoming immeasurably greater now in ways that we can't predict. Ronnie, I know that the Independent Budget Office does not make political recommendations or policy recommendations, and does not take bets on future policies. But do you see any possibility for a different tax system emerging, or a different basis for taxing individuals and corporations?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it is worth noting that, looking at what's been proposed in the current situation, and what in fact the city has done to bring its budget into balance, and for those people who aren't familiar with the city, ever since the 70s, the city is required to balance its budget on a generally accepted accounting basis. So they have to do it on the straight and narrow without doing things like deferring expenses or losing bills or stuff like that. So far, the city has managed to maintain budget balance by, for one thing, relying on federal assistance, of which I think everyone expects more will be coming. Some limited number of cuts, nothing like the sharp cuts we saw particularly in the 2001 downturn, and even in the 2009 downturn, and no changes in tax policy at this point. Unlike those other two downturns where there were big changes in tax policy, particularly in the earlier of the two. So right now, the city is managing to retain balance without hiking taxes, without doing major structural changes in taxes, and without loading up on the fines and fees that Destin is so concerned about. How long they can maintain that posture is, I think, an open question. So I've basically skirted your question, but hopefully giving you something to think about.
Kim, how do you
yeah,
see the political lineups in the current situation?
Well, I think, I mean, I think it's, again, a little bit, I mean, it'll be very interesting to see how the mayoral election plays out and how, I think the city has been, somewhat in contrast to the 70s, the emergence of, the left is actually in many ways stronger in New York now than it was then. The work that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been doing in Congress and kind of what her style of politics represents for the city, I think actually, is going to affect and shape what the nature of the debate is going forward in New York. So I think it is really a different, and then also the way this is playing out against the backdrop of the Trump presidency and its aftermath, I think also really will affect what seems possible. So I think in a way there is a broader, on one level, there's a broader, the ideological spectrum has a breadth that it hasn't for a while. And the question is whether, or what people will do with that. So.
Can I add on to that? Is that okay? Yeah, I think just on the politics piece. I mean, first off, this is just so rich. I'm troubled by a few things. I mean, the first thing I'll actually say is this point about the trade-off of interest rates, because on the one hand, with interest rates really low, and this is kind of, I'm arguing with myself now because I see the municipal bond market as an untoward game. And the leverage is, or the power dynamics are so profound and asymmetrical that I try to make the argument in the book of the importance of dislodging and decoupling infrastructure and social services from the private bond market and looking elsewhere. But on the other hand, because interest rates are so low, you can imagine a kind of progressive social movement usage of the bond market to borrow at really cheap rates to invest in social services and other kinds of provisions. But on the other hand, that deepens what Maurizio Lazzarato calls governance through debt. And kind of this whole point of strengthening finance and the outsized power over our lives. So I'm a little troubled by this sort of appeal and allure, almost a trap of low interest rates. So that's going through my mind. I mean, the other point about politics, and just to kind of build off what Kim was saying, the difference also in the 1970s is remember, we have COINTELPRO and the decimation of Black radical organizing, a threat which may still be there and persistent, but we can think about the movement for Black lives and the incredible interventions along with other power blocks. That is to say, we can think about the awareness of athletes, professional athletes, Black athletes in particular, who have recognized their voice around voting drives and so forth as potential allies with a great deal of capital, economic and social capital, as another kind of potential alliance in putting pressure on congressional figures and trying to pursue more equitable forms of city building. So, I mean, and then the other piece is professional medical association. So I've been amazed to see doctors, Black doctors in particular, who around the country have responded, have leveraged resources to try to make direct interventions around COVID testing and vaccine distribution. So we could think about in the 1970s, labor as one kind of crucial power block, but in this context, professional athletes, medical associations, and also social movements for the time being as being the sort of bottom up force to make a change. So, and I can I ask a question to you, Ronnie? I know you can't speak directly, but I mean, one of the things you can't speak directly to the politics, but can you maybe say a bit more about the mechanism for, in New York City at least, for increasing the payments in lieu of taxes? I mean, how does that work? Because if we're thinking about other institutions, firms, and so on fleeing New York City, perhaps, then at Columbia, NYU, the burden perhaps falls even more on those institutions who can't flee. So how does it actually work, mechanically speaking, to increase the payments in lieu of taxes?
The city of New York is a creation of New York State, which means that it doesn't have anything like the fiscal autonomy that the state of New York has, or any state would have. And in terms of its tax system, and payment in lieu of tax is part of the tax system, that is entirely at the discretion of the state. So the only change that the city of New York can make in its tax system by itself is to change the rate on its property tax, which does not happen very often. But everything else, a decline in a rate, a homeowner rebate, let's give these people pilots instead of charging them the property tax, you name it. All of that is state policy. It may at times come at the direction of home rule, but still there's this huge mismatch between the city having a tax structure that relies heavily on cyclically sensitive income taxes, not just the property tax, but things like business incomes and personal income taxes, but doesn't have the fiscal autonomy to say, hey, we've got to jack up the rate on the income tax on the high income earners because right now we need to fill a hole.
Let me raise another question about the politics of a recovery. A member of the audience has asked a question about whether there might be a shift toward a more progressive economic development policy in New York City, one that does not rely on financial institutions and the tech industry, perhaps. One that might do more than rhetorically praise small businesses and neighborhood shopping streets. Do you see any possibility for political support or social movement support for a different kind of economic development policy as observers, researchers, residents?
To some extent, it's swimming upstream. The problems with retail way predate the pandemic. The pandemic has exacerbated them. There's no one that I speak with who doesn't think that we should be doing more to preserve retail, local retail, which is very much in the character of the city. But at the same time, I don't know anyone who's not getting their goods off of Amazon. I don't know how to change that. Hopefully someone has an idea, but I don't have one.
Right. Well, I'm not sure that any innovative ideas are coming out of the city government agencies. I don't know. The city planning department is pursuing zoning changes that will continue to foster the growth of big retail stores and offices, which would seem to fly in the face of all of the trends that we've been discussing and that you've just mentioned, Ronnie. So I'm really wondering whether this city has the possibility to come up with more socially productive uses of space, uses of the workforce, and uses of whatever kinds of capital can be mobilized.
You know, I think,
Adam, unmute yourself.
I think that conversation and the, is one that's taking place, but quite far from either the city government or from many of it certainly isn't, it has not been represented so far in the mayoral campaign. And in a way, I think it actually, I guess I would go back a little bit to saying that what matters, or what might kind of precede that, is finding ways to bolster and support the existing public institutions of the city, kind of rather than rethinking all the aspects of economic development. I certainly think that this can potentially maybe become a time for thinking about the structure of tax abatements, and certain types of luxury developments, such as the Hudson Yards complex, which is now kind of sitting comedically, it not what people had in mind exactly when they built this gigantic thing. So I think the whole the experience of the last year calls into question the wisdom of such massive all the different public strings that were pulled to make that possible. So it should be possible to talk about whether you can redirect some of that energy, that capital, that will towards, towards meaningful support for small businesses, perhaps starting with rent reductions or controls on rent that would prevent landlords from benefiting while, jacking up rents and driving small businesses out. I think, though, in a way, the more direct question right now might be, can you pass taxes in Albany with the Democratic majority there that would actually, make New York, can you pass more progressive taxes that would help to close the budget shortfall and also to help redirect resources towards especially schools and public health? Can you, I think the point about the city being the creation of the state is obviously kind of legally true, but it also is a question of the division of fiscal responsibility, and the taxing power that a city has is less than that, which a state has, which in turn is less than that than the federal government has. And so the question is, who is taxing incomes and wealth, and how is that being distributed? And is it possible now to use the Democratic majority and the strength in particular of the left Democrats in Albany, to push, to do things like tax pied-à-terres and pass a millionaire's tax or other kinds of things that would both reflect the dependence of the wealthy on the infrastructure of New York, and also raise money for the public services that I think are kind of almost the precondition of the rest of the cooperative or small business economy. And this raises the question of Washington politics too, of course. And I think one thing that we might look for, and what the stimulus will look like, what the aid will look like, it even provides a different way of thinking about things like the broader parts of the questions like Medicare for all, in a way that is fiscal aid for cities, because it is, especially in the case of New York, because of the way that Medicaid is funded here. So I think there's a way, anyway, that's another way I would speak to the question about alternative modes of economic development and what they might look like. So
Other thoughts?
I came across a fascinating factoid in reading up for today's session, which may be pertinent to this question of like the ability to shift the balance of revenue and the social structure. That apparently 1,800 households in New York declare an income of over $10 million a year. And they're responsible for 20% of the total income tax take of the city. Now, the thing about that group, presumably, is they can afford extremely good legal and accounting advice, and that money could extremely easily be moved out of the city. And that is the blackmail of easy come, easy go wealth. And this is not a plaidoyer for succumbing to that and simply saying, well, in that case, we have to throw up our hands and there's nothing we can do. But I do think, it's a stark reflection of just how polarized income and wealth is in the city, how small that group is, 1,800 families. That's like one block, basically, of high rises. Maybe just one building in Hudson's Yard, they'd all fit. And yet 20%, right? So it does seem to me the politics that Kim is proposing of actually a sort of concerted view of how we want the fiscal structure to reflect income and wealth inequality in the state and in the city that's where a hard-bitten, a serious progressive politics has to act. But then we have to be very clear about how we contain their ability to move it all to Florida, right, which is where it'll go. So then you need to be thinking tactically about what kind of leverage you can exercise to make that difficult to do.
So we have social movements that have expressed a need for much more progressive taxation. We have a governor, still, who swears he will not allow taxes to be raised on the wealthy. The mayoral candidates are not taking a position on this, and in fact, there is at least one business candidate who may be a wolf or a sheep in wolf's clothing, but he probably will not suggest raising taxes on the very wealthy. So how is this going? And I don't really, although there was a concerted campaign against Amazon's HQ2 a couple of years ago, I have not seen a groundswell of protest against the city's economic development policies, or even the policies of most big companies here. So exactly what kind of progressive politics are we talking about? And where's the base for that?
Well, I think so. I guess just to return to the structure and question of tonight's panel, I do think a lot will depend upon how things play out over the next year or so. And it may be that there, if there is suppose that if the vaccines are distributed quickly, near universally, effectively and efficiently, that hasn't happened so far, but maybe it will kind of transpire over the next year. And maybe you will see a kind of return, the triumphant reopening of the stages and the restaurants, and maybe in a way, if the crisis kind of ebbs quickly, as in Shanghai, and you could imagine that whatever just the critical impetus or the sense of anxiety, fear, anger, outrage that people feel will dissipate. On the other hand, I think if it doesn't, there is actually I think I think there is a constituency for it would have to be mobilized, organized, generated. So it doesn't just exist automatically, but I do think that the crisis has revealed to many people the kind of their reliance on the functioning of a workable public sector and their dependence on it relative to that of people who can pick up and go anywhere they want to. And I just think out of that sense of disparity, which is, one that cuts across the middle class and poor people in New York and across many different types of people, there is the potential for a movement like that to be built. Now, does it exist right now? No, but it could potentially in the future. And I think the question of what unions will do is also important. And is there a way that they've also been in certain ways fairly quiet, at least around the public conversation in these areas? And will there be a connection, or what will the city's municipal unions do? How will they speak to the questions? There too, it will depend. If there's a recovery of revenues and there's no need for, they don't face more sustained pressure for cutbacks, there'll be one type of response. If the opposite is the case, you might see something different from that. So.
Yeah, I think just to kind of go back to this point about finance and the blackmail, I have no idea of which kinds of social movements will be capable of breaking the power of finance, and in particular, the blackmail that Adam had highlighted. So that to me is, when you ask the question, Sharon, what does a progressive movement look like? The question of what is the progressive response and method of mobilization around finances is to me the big mystery. It's part of my own life's work to try to contribute to that struggle. I do think, though, in terms of progressive politics, I think we can go back to the divest and invest slogan that was articulated over the summer, that is divesting from carceral solutions, bloated police budgets, and then taking that money, if you will, to invest in an expanded public sector that, for instance, hires healthcare workers to take care of elderly folks, that invest in mental services, again, creating work opportunities, that still pursues a more humane solution to homelessness and mental health issues in New York City, while again, sort of reinvesting and strengthening the public sector is one way of a progressive solution to work that doesn't rely on carceral solutions. And I think, though, the other question is around consumption. What does a progressive politics look like vis-a-vis consumption, and how can we avoid, in particular, the kind of ways in which proponents of Black capitalists might insert themselves and try to distort an otherwise progressive movement to redirect consumption towards their ends, but in ways that don't benefit poor and working class folks. So anyway, that's working across three different registers: production or work opportunities, consumption, and finance. The finance piece, I have no idea. The work piece, I think, is if we begin with the divest invest, we can land on a more expansive public sector. And then I think it also speaks to what I think Kim was speaking to. There's the ways in which the earlier question about small businesses and a progressive model and how to generate revenue is one thing, but there's also reclaiming the idea of the public. And there's a sort of ideological battle as well. And I think the divest invest framework allows us to do that, takes reclaiming the public very seriously, but again, allows people to be employed in a way that also builds out the public sector more generally.
If I might just quickly elaborate on Destin and Kim's interesting comments. It seems to me that there's two types of problem you could have with finance, right? One is, as it were, the real throttling at your jugular, cutting off your lifeblood kind of version, which is the classic version of the bond vigilantes of the 70s and 80s. And that is something to which we do have an antidote, not at the city level or state level, but by central bank policy at the national and global level. And that is then a matter of articulating a progressive politics at that level. And that is, in a sense, the world that we're in, at least the antechamber of right now. the other dimension, as it were, the local effect on the ground of the massive affluence generated by that sector when it's ticking along as well as it is. And that then, it seems to me, is a matter of, as it were, leveraging that as best we can, because that, after all, is purchasing power, and small less efficient small business feeds off that purchasing power because it has other values that it can actually provide. That is, of course, a generator of inequality. So it seems, and so then there would need to be offsetting strategies. So it would seem to me that we need a strategy that operates, as it were, at different levels, where, as it were, a national policy driven at the central banking level opens up the possibility for action locally. Just one final word to add, it's like, surely there has to be on our horizon here, and not the very far horizon, the whole issue of the green transformation, the energy transformation, and the turning of a city like New York City into a sustainable environment, which it clearly currently is not, when he has to live in an American building in the winter to discover how drafty they are. The entire place needs to be fundamentally rebuilt in very basic ways, so as to enable us to make the carbon transition in the next 20 years. So it has to start now. It had to have started yesterday, really. So the urgency of that, I think, can't be overstated. And that has to be a key part of a progressive politics immediately, in all its facets, including, of course, the massive dimensions of inequality that go along with that, racialized as they must be in the United States.
We only have about 5 more minutes of discussion. I'd like to return to a question that emerged in Adam's earlier comments. Is there any city that is handling the present crisis better than New York? What's going on? I'm not so sure about Shanghai. On the surface, at least from the photographs we see in the media, everything seems to be back to normal, even though a lot of people are still wearing masks in Shanghai and other Chinese cities. And those cities are still building a lot more offices and labs and tech centers than they were before. But I hear from Shanghai that they're also concerned with stimulating investment in the city. So I'm not sure that any city represents a model of economic recovery. But is there any city that we can look to in solidarity and curiosity about handling the crisis better? Adam, do you?
I mean, in a provocative way, you see, after the disaster of February and March, which culminated then in the killing time in April when people were dying so at such an extraordinary rate, after all, New York is a success story in comparative terms, right? If you compare it with its European comparators, London, Paris, even Berlin, have all had to go into exacerbated lockdown from November, and we've avoided that. So, the story of New York's experience is that we're still way down on where we need to be, and Ronnie and her team's data demonstrate this with extraordinary force. But in terms of the public health management of the crisis, New York has gone from being a disaster, I mean, a globally relevant disaster zone, to being a comparative success story. I mean, no reason to be glib about that, because the fallout is serious and the costs were huge. But the decision to stay, in a sense, in a suppressed state continuously, quite by contrast with Europe, has paid off.
Kim, do you see any other city offering us lessons?
That's a great question, Sharon. I confess, I'm not sure. So I don't have a very good answer to that. I don't have enough of a close, fine-grained sense of what other cities have been doing. So I would have to think about, I mean, or at least, especially not just in terms of the public health issues, but the questions about, how to manage the economic questions raised by the pandemic. I'm not sure. So I'll have to think. I'll have to think about it more. I'm curious though if either Ronnie or Destin has any ideas.
Destin.
Yeah, this is just my impression. I've been in San Francisco since March, and so I think I would just add that I think the variable of weather plays a part in this, only because it's pretty nice most of the time, and it's allowed for aside from the shutdowns, which have been very serious and stringent here. The building of parklets. And so just a few weeks ago, there was a bit of a kind of renaissance, if you will, in the neighborhood in which I'm located. And there was a great deal of commerce and consumption and people eating in safe ways outside. That obviously cannot work in much of the country at this moment, even in the Southwest. So I just wanted to add the variable of weather as I think perhaps explaining why San Francisco is maybe doing well, relatively speaking, but that's no solution for anyone else, and is so I would just kind of speak to the weather piece, but also I think there's an aspect of the question of success is I think around health, as Bay Area doctors who are trying to ensure equitable distribution of the vaccine. And so I think that's a part of the success story because it can become an engine of economic growth, or at least revitalization, opening up the opportunities for revitalization if folks feel more safe, if folks are vaccinated. And so I would give credit to the Bay Area doctors who are doing just remarkable work in that way. But there are doctors, of course, in DC, Atlanta, and elsewhere. So the medical professionals as key to recovery.
Absolutely. But, we've all been reading the same articles, I'm sure. And a lot of people have moved out of San Francisco. They seem to be moving to Boise, Idaho and Bozeman, Montana, raising housing prices in those places considerably, which again may make New York City a model of social regulation. Ronnie, I'd like to close by asking you a last question as well as a first question. Last question. Several people in the audience have written questions in the Q&A about alternative taxes that might be entertained. Again, I know you're not in the business of prediction or recommendation.
Exactly.
But what do you hear in the fiscal space? Do you hear anything about taxing remote workers or trying to tax the incomes of people who at least nominally work in New York City but live elsewhere, maybe in the metropolitan area or maybe in Bali? Anyway, do you hear about any new taxes?
The taxes I've primarily heard about are the ones that have already been discussed. The high-end millionaires tax, the pied-à-terre tax are the ones that are out there. Looking at our city's own income tax, I think it's been remarkable the extent to which the revenue take from the personal income tax is held up, despite the fact that so many New Yorkers are not anywhere near New York at this point, whether they're in San Francisco or upstate New York or wherever. And there's a court case between Massachusetts and New Hampshire that's about to test the extent to which New York City will be able to continue to enjoy the take of its property tax, even when so many of our residents or former residents are scattered. Our current employees and former residents are living elsewhere. And it's hard to see how that's going to play out, because if you remember, one of the city's big revenue sources was its commuter tax, and we lost that years and years ago. If there's one other thing I can throw into the mix, I'm really intrigued by what Kim has said about using this as an opportunity to appreciate and strengthen public institutions. And it strikes me that it's remarkable that nobody's mentioned the MTA yet, which is as close to existential crisis as I can think of. And in some ways, the city's great leveler, because without it, we're nowhere.
And that is certainly, the MTA is certainly recognized as an asset by the business community. So how it can be funded, that's a question for our next panel. I hope to reconvene these great people. The four of you, thank you so much. And let's make a date for reconvening 6 months from now to see what's happening. Thank you all so much on the panel, in the audience, and thanks to the Gotham Center for New York City History for being our host. Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Thanks.